Hello friend, welcome to Stories by Tocci. We bring you interesting folk tales. Please don't forget to hit the like button, please share, and don't forget to subscribe to my YouTube channel. Thank you for doing so. Now let's get into the story. The sound of evening traffic outside was a dull hum in Uju's ears as she sat in her office, her eyes fixed on the glowing screen but her mind far away. Stacks of files cluttered her desk, the kind of paperwork that never really ended. She had learned to drown in it. Her job as a senior admin officer in the state education board kept her far from home, both in hours and in kilometers. She lived alone in a modest apartment in Ugu, while her husband, Pato, remained with the children in Owari. At first, it was meant to be temporary, just a few months of separation until he could move, or until she got transferred. But months turned into years, and their weekend visits became phone calls, then voice notes, then silence filled with assumptions. Uju told herself it was for the best, a sacrifice for stability. The children were growing, Pato was hands-on, and she was building their future. That was what she kept telling herself, even when the nights felt longer than they used to. It was a rhythm they had fallen into, almost by accident. On Sunday evenings, she would call to hear the children's voices and Pato's updates, mostly brief and cheerful. But the truth was, Uju didn't really know what her home sounded like anymore. She'd grown used to the absence, convinced herself that love could stretch across cities if the foundation was solid enough. To cope, she relied on her younger sister, Amaka, who often traveled to Owari to help look after the kids when they had school breaks or when Pato had to travel. Uju trusted Amaka like an extension of herself. She never imagined there could be anything to worry about. Pato had always been a quiet man, soft-spoken and slow to anger, the type to let Uju lead decisions without resistance. In their 10 years together, she had never seen a crack in his character. If anything, his patience had been the glue that held them during her restless career journey. So when Amaka started sounding hesitant during their calls, pausing before answering, sighing more often, Uju didn't press too hard. Maybe she was just tired. Everyone was tired these days. But deep inside, a silence had started to take root in her. Not the peaceful kind, but the one that comes with not asking too many questions. There were things she didn't want to hear. Things that might upset the fragile structure she had worked so hard to build. The children's school fees were paid. There was food in the house. Her husband rarely asked for anything beyond what they had agreed on. From the outside, they were functioning, nothing glamorous, but steady. And Uju, ever the practical woman, believed in holding steady. It was easier to accept the distance than to dig too deep and risk shaking the ground beneath them. She buried herself in routine, office, church, market, sleep, and reminded herself that sacrifice was the price of success. If she could just make it through to retirement, they could finally be together again. The thought warmed her enough to survive another week away from home. Amaka wasn't someone given to suspicion. She was the kind of person who believed in giving people the benefit of the doubt, especially family. When she arrived at Uju's home in Owari for the midterm break, her only intention was to help. The children had grown since her last visit. Edaora, especially, seemed taller, more withdrawn, with the body of someone older than her years. Amaka noticed that Edaora avoided eye contact when spoken to, her responses clipped, her smile faint and unsure. At first, Amaka chalked it up to adolescence. She knew how awkward that age could be, how children retreated into themselves before finding their footing again. But there was something else, something she couldn't name, that sat just beneath the surface like a ripple refusing to settle. The house itself felt quiet in a strange way, not from peace, but from something being held back. The first time she saw Edaora slip into her father's room at night, Amaka barely registered it. She'd gone to the kitchen to get water and passed the dimly lit hallway, catching only the sound of a door clicking softly shut. It was late past 11, and the house was silent. She didn't ask questions the next morning, convincing herself that maybe Edaora had a bad dream. But it happened again the following night, and again the night after that, always around the same time, always without hesitation. The girl would rise from the mattress she shared with her siblings, tiptoe barefoot across the tiled floor, and disappear into Pato's room. What unsettled Amaka wasn't just the act itself, but how natural it seemed. Like a routine. Like something long established. On the fourth night, Amaka stayed up deliberately, pretending to be asleep while she waited. When Adara moved, she followed, quietly, cautiously. She didn't make it to the door in time to catch more than a glimpse of the child's nightgown slipping through the doorway. But the moment she reached out and touched the doorknob, a chill passed through her. She didn't open it. She couldn't. For the next few days, Amaka tried to observe more closely. She watched how Pato looked at Adora, how Adora looked away. She noticed the silence between them at the table, the careful distance, and the occasional flashes of something: guilt, shame, fear. Amaka couldn't place it, but she knew something was off. The younger children were their usual playful selves, unaware of any storm brewing beneath the roof. Amaka debated with herself for days. Should she call Uju? Would she even believe her? One evening, after putting the children to bed, Amaka sat alone in the parlor, phone in hand, heart pounding. When she finally made the call and told Uju what she had observed, the response was swift and cold. Uju's voice rose like a wall between them, thick with denial and insult. "How dare you say such things about my husband?" she snapped. "If this is how you repay me for trusting you, then leave my house." Amaka's voice trembled as she tried to explain, but it was no use. That night she packed her bag in silence and left the house before sunrise, the weight of her suspicion heavy on her shoulders, and her love for her sister now entangled with something far more painful: hopelessness. The house felt unusually quiet when Ngozi arrived. She was a thin, soft-spoken woman in her early 20s, hired through a neighbor's recommendation after a few brief phone calls. Uju had been desperate to find help quickly and didn't bother with lengthy interviews. Ngozi was grateful. She needed the job badly, and the house, with its well-tiled floors and furnished rooms, seemed peaceful enough. Her first few days passed smoothly. The children were polite, though the eldest, Adora, hardly spoke unless spoken to. Pato, their father, was polite too, maybe too polite. He didn't talk much, just nodded and smiled, his voice barely above a whisper whenever he gave instructions. Ngozi told herself that every home had its own rhythm, and she was just getting used to theirs. But there was a stillness in the air, as if the house itself was hiding something, and soon that stillness began to feel heavy. As the days turned to weeks, Ngozi began to notice patterns, not loud or obvious ones, but small things that clung to her memory longer than they should have. She saw the way Adora never sat too far from her father, how she froze when he entered the room, how her eyes sometimes darted toward him as if seeking permission before speaking. The closeness wasn't like that of a daughter to her father. It was quiet, possessive, even fearful. One afternoon, while folding clothes in the hallway, Ngozi heard low murmurs behind the master bedroom door. At first, she ignored it, assuming it was just a regular conversation. But then, the sound shifted, a tone, a giggle, then silence. It sent a cold wave through her spine. She stepped away quickly, her hands trembling slightly. She didn't want to assume anything. After all, it was none of her business. But the unease didn't leave. It sat in her stomach, hard and sour. She found herself watching Adora more closely, searching for confirmation of the unspoken thing that had begun to haunt her thoughts. Eventually, the fear she felt grew too loud to keep to herself. One evening, while sweeping the front veranda, Ngozi confided in Doris, a woman she had seen often visiting the house, who she later learned was a family friend. Ngozi kept her words careful, never accusing, only suggesting. Madam, she said softly, I think something strange is going on between Olga and the girl. It doesn't look right. Doris paused, blinking, then brushed it off with a forced laugh. Gozy, don't let your imagination run wild. Be careful, O. You're just a maid. The words were a warning more than a reply. That night, Uju called Nosy into the living room. Her tone was calm, too calm. She said she appreciated her help, but the job was no longer available. No explanation. No anger. Just an envelope with her pay, and a door quietly closed behind her. As Ngozi walked away in the evening heat, she couldn't shake the feeling that the house she had just left was drowning in secrets, and everyone inside it was choosing to breathe underwater. Uju stood in the center of her sitting room, staring at the cardboard box that held her certificates, awards, and 2 pairs of office shoes. The final paperwork had been signed that morning at the ministry, and just like that, her 30-year service in the civil sector was over. Retirement had always seemed like a far-off reality, something to dream of when the workload became unbearable or the loneliness of another Sunday without her children crept in. Now that it was here, she felt uncertain. The house was familiar but not warm, as though it had adjusted in her absence and no longer recognized her presence. Pato welcomed her with a smile, helped her unpack, kissed her on the forehead like an old friend, not like a man who had longed for his wife's return. The children offered their greetings with respect but no excitement. Adora, now more grown than ever, offered a forced hug that barely lasted a second. Uju noticed, but she didn't ask questions. She told herself it was just transition. They would all need time to reconnect. Within a week, the 9 million naira gratuity was transferred into her account. Uju stared at the bank alert on her phone for several minutes, feeling a strange mix of pride and fear. That money represented a lifetime of service, missed birthdays, ignored illnesses, and lonely anniversaries. It was supposed to be the start of something better. Pato was the first to bring up the idea how they could finally go into business together. His voice had more enthusiasm than she'd heard in years. He painted pictures of car lots, import licenses, registered trade names. We'll double the money in a year, he said, holding her hands as if sealing a vow. He promised to handle everything. He knew the contacts. He knew the routes. Uju listened quietly. She wanted to believe in a shared dream, something that would reconnect them. The tiredness in her spirit, the distance that had grown between them, she hoped the business would fix it all. Against the cautious voice within her, she transferred the entire amount to his account 2 days later. Out of love. Out of hope. Out of trust. But weeks turned into months, and nothing took shape. The supposed car lot remained an idea. When she asked gently, he gave excuses, port delays, supplier issues, documentation setbacks. His phone rang often, and he stepped out to take the calls. Uju watched his movements, his growing irritability, the late nights, the unspoken tension that spread through the house like smoke. She asked again, this time firmer. Pato snapped, accusing her of nagging, of not having faith in his plans. He walked out that evening, leaving her seated in the dining room with untouched yam porridge and a sinking heart. Slowly, the truth began to emerge in pieces, through overheard conversations, receipts that didn't match the story, whispers from a neighbor who mentioned seeing Pato at a gambling bar. Uju didn't confront him yet. She didn't cry. She just sat with it, letting the betrayal settle into her bones like a slow poison. The money was gone, and with it, the last illusion of partnership. Something inside her, something quiet and soft, began to crack. But she didn't speak. Not yet. Air between them was dry, full of unfinished sentences and gestures that once meant something but now held nothing. Uju had stopped asking about the business. There was no point. Every inquiry ended in blame or silence. What troubled her more, though, wasn't the money or even the growing emptiness of their marriage. It was the way Adaora had retreated into herself. The girl barely spoke, rarely smiled, and seemed to exist in a fog of obedience and tension. She did her chores without being told, responded only when spoken to, and avoided long eye contact. Uju watched her carefully, unsure what she was looking for, but aware that something about her daughter had changed in a way that felt unnatural. One afternoon, Uju was cleaning out the bottom drawer of the kitchen cupboard when she stumbled upon an old, half-used notebook. It belonged to Edaora. Inside were short diary entries, clumsy handwriting, sometimes scratched out, sometimes left mid-sentence. One entry stopped her heart cold. I hate the nights. I wish I could sleep without locking my feelings in a box. There were no names, no confessions, just scattered expressions of a child who was clearly carrying something too heavy for her age. Uju closed the book and sat on the floor, her back pressed against the cupboard, staring at the wall for what felt like hours. Her mind raced. Could it be? No. She shook the thought away violently. She had seen nothing, heard nothing. And yet echoes of her sister's voice returned, words she had dismissed, warnings she had turned into insults. The shame began to settle. She wanted to talk to Edaora, to reach into her silence and drag her out, but each time she tried, the girl would simply nod or say, "I'm fine." It was a rehearsed line, almost robotic. Uju didn't push. She didn't know how. That night, as she lay beside Pato in the dark, wide awake while he snored gently, she found herself staring at the ceiling. The shadows shifted with each movement of the ceiling fan, forming shapes that disappeared before she could name them. She thought of the life they had built, or thought they had built. She thought of trust, how easy it was to give, how impossible it was to reclaim once broken. Her body was beside him, but her spirit was elsewhere, floating through memories, searching for a moment where she could say everything changed. But there was no clear turning point, just slow erosion. She had stopped recognizing the man she married, and now she feared she might have never known him at all. The silence between them was not safety, it was a warning. A storm had already passed through their home, and she was only now noticing the wreckage. And still, she didn't speak. Not yet. It was the kind of afternoon that began like any other, hot, sluggish, and thick with the scent of pepper and fish stew lingering in the air. Uju had gone to the market early, as she often did on Saturdays, wearing a simple wrapper and blouse, bargaining with familiar traders, her basket slowly filling with the usual tomatoes, onions, okra. But something about that day felt off. The sun stung harder than usual, and her spirit itched with a discomfort she couldn't name. Halfway through her shopping, she paused beside a fish seller, her hand frozen mid-selection. A strange heaviness had settled on her chest. Strange to brush it off as tiredness, but it clung to her, pulled her thoughts toward home. Without warning or explanation, she turned around, left the remaining items on her list, and headed back. She told herself she must have forgotten to switch off the gas or lock the gate properly. But deep down, even she knew it wasn't about gas or locks. It was something else, something calling her. The compound was silent when she arrived. No voices, no footsteps, no sign of movement. Uju pushed the gate slowly and entered. Her slippers made soft, sticky sounds on the tiled corridor as she walked inside. The front door was unlocked. The house, dim and still, felt like it had been holding its breath. At first, she thought the children might be napping. She called out, once, then again, no response. She dropped the market basket on the kitchen floor and moved toward the hallway. The bedroom door was halfway open. What she saw in that brief sliver of space would stay with her for the rest of her life. Pato's bare back moved slowly over the tiny, trembling frame beneath him. Her daughter, Edaora. Uju's body froze, but her mind screamed. The world tilted. For a moment the room pulsed with silence, then a scream tore from her throat, raw and rising from a place she had never known existed inside her. Pato scrambled up, muttering incoherent words, his trousers halfway on. Edeora curled into herself, eyes shut, as if by closing them she could vanish. Uju couldn't move. Her limbs refused. Her breath came in chokes. The betrayal wasn't just physical, it was spiritual, emotional, maternal. Everything she had defended, all the doubts she had silenced, had just stood before her in flesh and horror. She didn't wait for explanations. There was nothing he could say, no lie smooth enough to cover this wound. She backed out of the room, then out of the house, each step disconnected from the ground beneath her. She sat on the veranda for minutes she couldn't count, until the rush of her children's voices in the distance reminded her she still had more than one child to protect. That evening, without a word to her husband, she packed their clothes into sacks. No suitcases, no planning, just instinct. Her hands shook as she zipped up Adeora's school bag. The girl hadn't spoken since the incident, only watched her mother with wide, silent eyes. When they stepped out of the house, into the lowering evening light, Uju didn't look back. Whatever life she had imagined inside those walls had ended. All that remained now was escape. The streetlights flickered to life just as Uju and the children stepped onto the main road with two bulging gano, must-go bags, and a cracked plastic bucket. Adeora clutched the younger ones tightly, her silence now a shield rather than a wound. Uju's hands trembled as she flagged down a kiki, her eyes darting left and right, afraid that Pato might appear behind them, that he might shout, plead, or worse, pretend nothing happened. But the gate remained closed. When the kiki arrived, they squeezed into it with more heaviness than space. Uju didn't even know where they were going. There was no plan, just the urgent, choking need to leave. She remembered a woman she once bought crayfish from at the market who had mentioned she rented out a single room behind her store. It wasn't much, but in that moment it became her destination. The room was smaller than Uju imagined, with a single small window covered by a thin curtain stained with old oil marks. The walls bore the imprint of former tenants, rusted nail holes, faint chalk drawings, peeling patches. There was barely enough space to lay two foam mattresses side by side, but it was shelter. It was not home, but it was not his house. That alone made it sacred. The landlord, an elderly woman with tired eyes, agreed to take a small deposit and 1 month's rent when Uju explained her situation in broken sentences, hiding the full truth behind careful words like family emergency and separation. That night, as they lay on the floor, Uju stayed awake watching her children's faces in the dim glow from the window. Adeora didn't cry. She hadn't shed a single tear. It scared Uju more than if she had screamed. She reached out and touched her daughter's hand, but Adeora didn't flinch. She just turned her face to the wall and remained still. Morning came too quickly. With only a few thousand era in her purse, Uju took to the roadside to search for a way to earn money. The former comfort of her career, the structured monthly salary, the respect of her office, all of it had disappeared with the life she walked away from. She found a woman frying akara and asked if she could assist for a daily wage. The woman studied her for a moment and said yes. It was the first step. The children stayed in the room, quiet and confused, while Uju poured oil, flipped bean cakes, and fought the heat of the sun. The shame of her new reality sat like a stone in her chest, but it didn't stop her. She didn't tell anyone where she was, not even Doris. What could she say? That she ignored every warning? That she traded her family's concern for a man who took everything? No. She worked until her palms blistered and her shoulders ached. Survival, now, was not an idea. It was her only task. Every naira counted, every hour on her feet mattered. There was no room for pride, only room to rebuild what she could salvage from the ruins. Word traveled fast, as it always does in close-knit families. By the second week of Uju's quiet disappearance, calls began to trickle in, some from relatives who claimed they were just checking, others from old neighbors pretending not to know the story. But Uju stayed guarded. She answered few calls, spoke even fewer words, and shared her location with no one. When she finally reached out to her elder brother, Chaik, hoping for a moment of comfort or understanding, what she received was a cold, clipped voice on the other end. "So now you remember us? After you chose that man over your own blood?" The shame Uju had buried rose slowly like bitter bile. She tried to explain, not the full horror, but enough to be heard. Chaik responded with silence. "Then I warned you. Amaka warned you. You drove her away. The line went dead." That night, she sat outside the room, beneath the soft rattle of mosquitoes and distant laughter from a nearby compound, and cried quietly, not because of what was said, but because she knew he was right. The hardest part wasn't the struggle to find money, or the shame of her fall. It was the loneliness, the kind that swells in your throat and makes your body ache even when surrounded by your children. Adair still hadn't spoken about what happened. Not a single word. She obeyed instructions, helped sweep the room, warmed water for the younger ones, but her eyes had grown older, hard, and unreadable. Uju ached to hold her, to break through that wall of silence, but didn't know how. Sometimes she would start a sentence, only for it to die halfway. "Ada Ora, I didn't know," and the girl would turn her face away. On some evenings, Uju imagined herself walking into her sister's compound, falling at Amaka's feet, asking for forgiveness with nothing but tears. But pride held her back, pride and fear that she had broken something too deep to be mended. And so she swallowed it all, the regret, the guilt, the echoes of memories where laughter used to live. When Pato's family finally reached out, it wasn't to ask about the children or to express concern. It was to suggest that Oji return and settle things quietly. They said Adair must have misunderstood something, that girls her age imagined things, and that surely no man would do such a thing to his own child. Uju listened in silence, holding the phone tightly against her ear, her free hand pressed against her chest to keep her breathing steady. The call ended with a soft threat, cloaked in care. "You know people talk. You wouldn't want this to bring shame to your children in the future." After that call, Uju sat her children down, looked each one in the eye, and spoke words she hadn't dared say before. "We are not going back. Ever." It was the first time she spoke with such finality. Her voice didn't shake. She had nothing left to lose, and somehow, in that emptiness, she began to find a new kind of strength. One that didn't need permission. One that didn't care who believed her. The days bled into weeks, and the rhythm of survival slowly softened into a routine. Uju had managed to save enough to start selling cooked food from a wooden table just beside the main road. She rose before dawn, boiling rice and frying stew with borrowed pots and a second-hand stove she bought from a neighbor. The air was still heavy with judgment. Some people stared, others whispered, but no one said anything to her face. She kept her head down and her hands busy. The children were enrolled in a modest public school nearby. It wasn't much, but it gave them structure. She walked them there every morning and waited at the same spot in the afternoon to bring them home. Even in her silence, Aura stayed close, never walking more than 2 steps away from her mother. There were still no conversations about the past. Just a fragile piece held together by movement. Eat, wash, sleep, repeat. It was the local health center nurse who finally broke the silence, a woman named Mrs. Igioma, who sometimes came to buy food from Uju's stand, noticed Adora's distant eyes and cautious manner. One afternoon, as she packed her takeaway, she asked gently, "Is she okay?" Uju paused, unsure how to respond. She wanted to say, "No, she's not. None of us are," but the words caught in her throat. Igioma didn't push. Instead, she returned the next week with the contact of a small nonprofit that offered free counseling for abused children. At first, Uju hesitated. She feared the labels, the gossip, the judgment. But one night, as she watched Adora fold her school uniform with quiet precision, she knew she couldn't afford pride. The following Tuesday, they went together. Adora said nothing during the first session. She just sat, legs crossed, eyes on the floor. But by the third visit, her voice returned, soft, broken, but hers. It was the first crack in the wall. As Adora began to speak, Uju found herself unraveling too. The guilt she had carried silently began to leak through her cracks. Some nights she cried after the children slept. Not loud sobs, just the kind of tears that leak from the corner of the eyes and soak into the pillow unnoticed. She wrote letters to Amaka that she never sent. She thought of the past not as a series of memories, but as a chain she had willingly wrapped around her own ankles. Yet, in the midst of this sorrow, something else began to grow, a slow, steady resolve. Her food stand gained more customers. One woman even offered to help her apply for a soft loan to expand. The children started smiling again, even the youngest began singing on his way to school. And Adora, though still quiet, began to hum while doing chores. It wasn't healing in the way Uju once imagined, it was healing with scars. But it was real. It was theirs. And it was enough. Day was unusually still. The sky hung low with gray clouds, not yet raining but threatening to. Uju stood outside the old house, the one she had once called home. Its walls were stained from age and neglect, the paint peeling in long, tired curls. Weeds had begun to push through the cracks in the pavement. She had returned not to stay, but to collect a few belongings she had left behind: certificates, her mother's old wrapper, a photo frame hidden in the back of a cupboard. A neighbor had called to say Pato was no longer living there. He'd vanished a few weeks after she left, taking only what he could carry. The house was empty now. Uju hesitated at the threshold, her hand resting against the door frame. It felt smaller than she remembered. Or perhaps she had just outgrown it in more ways than one. She moved through the space slowly. The parlor still smelled faintly of dust and forgotten time. Her feet carried her past the kitchen, past the children's room, until she stood in front of the one door she had never opened since that day. The master bedroom, the place where her world had collapsed in one unbearable moment. For a long time she stood there, hand hovering over the doorknob, her breath shallow. Part of her wanted to turn back, to leave it shut forever. But another part, stronger now, needed to see it one last time, not to relive the horror, but to take ownership of it. She opened the door slowly. The air inside was stale, untouched. The bed was still unmade, the same worn curtain drooped over the window. Nothing had moved, yet everything had changed. She stepped in. The room no longer frightened her. It no longer held power. It was just wood, cloth, and memory. And she was no longer the woman who had once crumbled in its doorway. By the time she returned to the one-room apartment, the sky had begun to drizzle. The children were playing in the narrow corridor, their laughter echoing against concrete walls. Adora looked up and smiled faintly at her. It wasn't forced this time. Uju paused, watching her for a moment longer than necessary. That smile was her reward, not for being right, but for surviving, for finally listening, for choosing her child when it mattered most. She joined them on the floor, lifting a plate of roasted groundnuts and joining in the evening chatter. There was still pain. There were still gaps between them that healing hadn't filled. But in that small room filled with warm voices, she realized something she hadn't dared believe before. Peace was possible. Not the kind you chase in silence or sacrifice for appearances, but the kind you earn, slowly, with truth, with scars, and with the courage to start again. Hope you enjoyed this interesting story. Please don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to my channel. See you again in my next story.